You sit before me carrying a question that is not only about others but also about yourself. Why do empaths disappear without warning, and why do they never return? Is it an act of abandonment or something far deeper, written into the very fabric of their being? To begin unraveling this mystery, we must journey beyond the visible patterns of behavior and descend into the hidden chambers of the psyche, where archetypes whisper in hushed tones, shadows breathe with quiet urgency, and the soul itself arranges the pathways of escape. What you call an empath is not simply a personality type, nor is it a tender, sentimental trait. It is instead an ancient wound that has been reshaped into a vessel of heightened sensitivity. The empath is not born from ease, but from fracture. Somewhere in the tangled corridors of early life, survival demanded they sense what was unspoken, feel what remained hidden, and anticipate what others denied. This capacity was not gifted from heaven alone. It is the scar that becomes luminous, the trauma that learns to listen. The empath enters relationships carrying this finely tuned organ of perception. Though invisible, it is always alert, always absorbing. They do not merely hear words. They feel the tremor beneath them, the slight hesitation in a voice, the subtle contradiction between a gesture and the mask it hides behind. When they give, they do so with the entirety of their nervous system, not just thought, not just intention. But if they linger too long in the presence of deception, indifference, or exploitation, they begin to wither from within. Rarely do they cry out. Their archetype is that of the healer, the wounded physician who believes that with enough patience, enough devotion, enough love, they can mend the fractured temple of another soul. And yet the psyche has boundaries that cannot be crossed indefinitely. It is in dreams that the first signs of collapse emerge. They dream of drowning in houses where ceilings leak endlessly, of carrying infants that wail without rest, of wandering through endless cities where strangers strip them of pieces of clothing. These are not mere illusions of sleep, but stark images of depletion. The unconscious cries out, voicing what the waking mind refuses to acknowledge. Eventually, the unconscious takes action, and when it does, it acts with speed, finality, and without explanation. One day the empath remains present, listening, offering, enduring. The next, silence falls like a curtain. They vanish without a word, for words would only be captured, twisted, or dismissed. A departure is not a calculated choice, but an eruption of the soul, an instinctive escape written in their very design. And this is why, no matter the persuasion or plea, you cannot bring them back. Once an empath psyche has torn away from a situation, it is not the conscious ego that made the decision. Rather, it is the deeper self, the archetypal center of the psyche, that quietly orchestrates the entire journey of individuation. What seems sudden to the outer world is, in truth, a command issued from the depths. The self whispers enough. And when the self speaks, the conscious mind has no choice but to obey, even if it does not fully grasp the reason. A return is impossible because returning would mean stepping once more into the same tomb that had already drained their lifeblood. The archetype of resurrection never takes one back into the grave. Instead, it opens a passage into another life, into a landscape not yet known, but utterly necessary. Consider the myth of Persephone. She is taken into the underworld, forced to taste its fruit and bound to its shadows. Yet once she emerges into the upper world, she never comes back in the same form. She becomes the goddess of the cycle itself, the guardian of descent and renewal. Her story teaches that some descents are inevitable, yet no return is ever truly a return. It is a transformation. So too with the empath. To others, their departure may appear sudden and abrupt, but the truth is that their soul has been descending quietly for a long time. The visible act of leaving is merely the final sign of an inner metamorphosis already complete. What renders this departure so devastating to those who remain is not only the absence but the silence. And silence, as unsettling as it feels, is the language of the self. When the ego on the other side refuses dialogue, the empath knows instinctively that any attempt to explain will be met with denial, gaslighting, or manipulation. They have already been caught in the endless cycle of justifications and apologies. Thus, leaving without a word is not cruelty. It is an act of psychic survival, a way of honoring their own boundaries when words would only be twisted. Imagine a bird trying to explain to the cage why it must fly. The cage does not understand flight, it only understands confinement, and so the bird does not linger in debate, it simply breaks free. Now you may wonder, why never return? Because to return would be to betray the wisdom of the self. When the soul commands departure, it is never a rehearsal, it is the final act. The empath knows, even if unconsciously, that going back would mean being consumed to death. They are not escaping responsibility, they are obeying a deeper law, the law of psychic conservation. Just as the body cannot pour blood endlessly without renewal, the psyche cannot bleed out energy without collapsing. And collapse is not individuation, collapse is annihilation. Still, I must tell you, the empath's departure is more than disappearance, it is also a message. It is like a mirror suddenly snatched away, forcing those who once leaned on the empath's unending availability to face the silence of their own shadow. Many find this unbearable. They label the departure betrayal, abandonment, even cruelty. But in truth, the empath's withdrawal is the only way others are compelled to confront their parasitic patterns. In this sense, the empath becomes an unwilling teacher of boundaries. By disappearing, they reveal the hunger that was being silently fed, the unconscious vampirism that was never confessed but always present. This mystery of disappearance is not only an intimate interpersonal rupture, but also a reflection of something collective. We live in a culture that glorifies constant availability, constant giving, constant empathy, as though the soul could be mined without end. Yet archetypally, no figure can inhabit the role of the sacrificial lamb forever. Even Christ is crucified only once. He does not return again and again to the cross to appease the insatiable demands of the unconscious crowd. In the same way, the empath's sudden vanishing becomes a kind of microcosmic crucifixion, a moment where they refuse to be sacrificed any longer. At that instant, they step into the archetype of the wanderer, the exile, the one who carries their rare sensitivity into an unknown destiny. But let us be careful, this process is not to be romanticized. For the empath, leaving is rarely triumphant. It is more often lonely, disorienting, and drenched in guilt. They wrestle with the relentless inner voices that call them selfish, cold, or ungrateful. They fear being misunderstood by those who only saw their presence as a given. And yet, this very suffering is part of individuation. Every soul seeking its own wholeness must at some point bear the guilt of disobeying the demands of the collective. Individuation is always branded as betrayal in the eyes of the tribe. Yet to remain loyal to the tribe while silencing the command of the self is to betray the soul itself. The dreams that arise after such a departure confirm this truth. No longer do they dream of drowning or of infants who never stop crying. Instead, they dream of discovering hidden rooms in their own house, of entering a vast forest they never knew existed, of meeting figures who place forgotten tools into their hands. These dreams are not random. They are the unconscious beginning to restore balance, to replenish what was drained. The psyche is gathering strength, rebalancing energy, and redirecting it toward renewal. While the empath is not only leaving another behind, they are returning step by step to themselves. And you, if you have ever been left by such a soul, must ask a harder question. Not why did they leave me, but rather, what part of me demanded their endless sacrifice? To learn from their departure is to face your own shadow, the unloved child within who demanded endless care, the tyrant within who consumed love without ever offering reciprocity. If you can endure this mirror without turning away, then perhaps you too can begin your own individuation. In this sense, the empath's departure may be the wound that forces you into your own descent, your own meeting with the deeper self. I tell you this not to condemn but to reveal. The departure of the empath is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of another. In every archetypal drama, disappearance does not mark finality. It announces transformation. When the empath leaves without warning and never returns, it is not because they hate, but because they are compelled by love for the self. They vanish into the night. But the silence they leave behind is not empty. It is charged, alive, full of meaning. It waits for you to interpret. It waits for you to grow. When we speak of the empath leaving, it is crucial to understand that this departure is not simply a physical act of walking away. It is a profound psychic rupture. It is as though an invisible thread, one that silently bound them to another, has been cut by forces far greater than conscious willpower. What appears sudden on the outside is, in truth, an event orchestrated deep within. I have often said that the psyche is not ruled by the fragile structures of the conscious ego, but by deeper patterns, what I have called the collective unconscious. Within this hidden realm, the empath is tied to archetypes of sacrifice and redemption, and they embody, without always realizing it, the ancient myth of the healer, the saint, or even the scapegoat. And yet, every archetype conceals its own shadow. When the healer archetype tips out of balance, it mutates into the martyr, endlessly bleeding, sacrificing, and unable to claim life for themselves. This is why the leaving often feels abrupt. The martyr does not slowly fade away. Instead, they are rescued by the unconscious through a sudden, radical act. It is the archetype reasserting balance, an eruption that prevents nothing less than psychic death. One day, the empath is held by chains of invisible loyalty, bound by ties they cannot explain. The next day, those chains have melted like wax under a fire. To the outside observer, such a shift may appear cold, cruel, even ruthless. Yet inside the empath it feels like salvation itself. They are pulled away not by choice but by destiny, and if you look closely you may notice that such people often vanish not into the arms of another, but into solitude. They do not rush to replace one bond with another, nor do they leap into fresh obligation. Instead, they disappear into silence, stepping into the ancient archetype of the hermit. This solitude is not a rejection of love, but a necessity, for it is the only space where they can finally hear their own voice again. For years, they have lived like a finely tuned harp, resonating with every vibration, every passing touch from others. Now that same instrument must be retuned toward the self. Solitude in this light is not abandonment of humanity, but the re-establishment of psychic boundaries. It is the alchemy of the soul in retreat. In their dreams during this phase, empaths encounter vast landscapes, forests that stretch endlessly, caves that shelter like hidden wombs, oceans without horizon. These are not idle fantasies. They are images of the unconscious itself. The soul, once drained by endless demands, now seeks nourishment from the wilderness of its own depth. The forest restores with images of rootedness and strength. The cave provides the womb of renewal, a return to primal safety. The ocean dissolves false identities, the masks built from pleasing and appeasing others. The psyche delivers precisely the medicine that the conscious ego could never prescribe. And why, you may ask, do they never return? Because the archetypal current that carries them forward does not flow backwards. Individuation is not a closed circle looping endlessly into the same cage. It is a spiral, always moving higher, always pressing into new territory. Even if it revisits familiar themes, when an empath departs, the person they once were is already gone. Even if they stand once more before the same people, they are no longer available in the same way. The departure is not a temporary step back, it is an initiation. And once initiated, the initiate cannot return to innocence. You may ask, is there not room for forgiveness? Is there not space for reconciliation? Yes, forgiveness is possible, profoundly so, but forgiveness does not mean re-entry. The empath may forgive with a whole heart, yet forgiveness is not the same as return, for within them the archetype of martyrdom has already been burned away. They no longer carry the same compulsion to heal, to save, to endure without end. Forgiveness is an act of inner release, not an invitation to repeat old patterns. Do not confuse the two. When an empath forgives, it is often a blessing given from afar, a quiet closing of karmic cycles. Think of the phoenix. It burns completely in the flames, and it rises anew. The ashes do not reassemble into the old bird. They cannot. They are gone. The phoenix that emerges carries both continuity and transformation. The empath who has left and never returned is like this. You may see them again, but they are not the same soul you once knew. They are another version, one born from fire, no longer bound to the past. To demand that they return to what once was is to ask for the impossible, to ask ashes to rise and form themselves again into the old body. And yet we must look deeper. The empath does not leave only because of external exploitation or the endless needs of others. They leave because their soul itself demands individuation. The people they walk away from were mirrors, mirrors of their own shadow. Mirrors that force them to confront how they betrayed themselves. Yes, the other may have consumed, demanded, and wounded, but the deeper truth for the empath is this. They allowed it. They permitted it to continue, trapped by unconscious patterns of guilt, fear, or duty. And so the self, vast, undeniable, finally compels them to break away, not only from the other, but also from their own complicity, their shadowed participation in the cycle. That is why the departure feels so irrevocable. It is not just leaving a person, it is leaving an old identity. This is the deeper mystical law at work. When the self intervenes, the ego has no power. The self does not bargain, it does not negotiate, it commands. It is the archetype of God within the psyche, the totality of who you are destined to become. And when it says, enough, the empath cannot remain. The departure becomes obedience to the inner God image, even as the conscious mind trembles in fear or doubt. And so what is left for those who have been abandoned by an empath? Pain, confusion, even rage, perhaps. Yet within this loss lies a hidden, sacred opportunity. The sudden absence forces you to confront your own dependence, your own unspoken hunger for endless giving. Perhaps without realizing, you were consuming the empath's energy because you could not nourish yourself. Perhaps you mistook their sacrifice for love. And now, standing before the silence they left behind, you are asked to face the emptiness within. If you can endure this confrontation, if you can stand before your own shadow without denial or escape, then the empath's departure is no longer only a wound, it becomes a gift, a hidden initiation. What once felt like loss transforms into a doorway, a threshold into your own individuation. In myth, after all, the healer never stays forever. Hermes appears, delivers his message, and vanishes into air. Christ heals and then withdraws into solitude. The shaman tends to the tribe, but always returns to the wilderness. The empath, too, belongs to this lineage of figures. They are not meant to remain as permanent caretakers, endlessly available. They arrive as messengers of the unconscious, showing both the profound possibility of love and the subtle danger of consuming it. When they vanish, it is the archetype completing its role. To cling to them forever would be to reject the lesson they carried. So when you ask why empaths leave without warning, understand this. The warning was always present, hidden in the silences, in the exhaustion of their bodies, in the dreams they could not bring themselves to speak aloud. And when you ask why they never return, remember, they have obeyed a greater law than human comfort, a law written by the soul itself. They have stepped into their individuation, and they will not trade it for the security of the familiar. The only return is symbolic. They return to themselves, not to you, and yet mystery remains. For sometimes, in the vast unfolding of time, paths cross again. But if that happens, do not expect to meet the same person you once knew. Expect instead a soul transfigured, one who carries new symbols, one who has walked through deep forests of solitude, one who has opened the hidden rooms of the psyche. The bond, if it reappears, will not be what it once was, yet it may still hold meaning. A different kind of connection, no longer parasitic, but equal, no longer compulsive, but free. This is the paradox. The empath leaves without warning. They never return as before, but through their departure, they awaken both themselves and those they leave behind. The departure is an ending, yes, but also a beginning. A seed planted in darkness, invisible at first, yet destined to sprout in ways no one can predict. For when an empath departs, there follows a haunting stillness, a silence that feels more alive than presence itself. It is as though the psychic field has shifted, leaving behind an absence more powerful than what once filled the space. And you must come to understand, absence is never empty. It is heavy with meaning, filled with all the projections that once clung to the empath, now returned to their source. The other begins to feel the hunger that was once silently fed, the need that was once disguised beneath endless demands. And this is why the empath's departure unsettles so deeply. It reveals what was hidden all along. We like to believe that people leave because of arguments, betrayals, disappointments, external conditions we can measure, but the empath leaves because of something far deeper. They leave because the unconscious, like the receding tide, has withdrawn from the shore of the relationship. And when the tide withdraws, no force of will can ever call it back. The energy is gone. The archetype has moved on. The river has carved another path through unseen landscapes. This is why words so often fail in these moments. People demand explanations, closure, a clear narrative they can hold in their hands like a shield against uncertainty. Yet the empath has none to give, no story that could satisfy, because their leaving cannot be reduced to logic. They themselves may not fully grasp why the departure came so suddenly, only that staying would have meant death by slow suffocation. It is not rational calculation that carries them out the door, but instinct, archetypal instinct, the ancient whisper of survival, written in the language of the unconscious. The departure of the empath is closely tied to the archetype of the exile, one of the oldest patterns in human myth. In mythology, exile is never merely punishment. It is also initiation. Moses flees Egypt, not because he fully understands his destiny, but because an act of violence drives him into the wilderness. There, in solitude, he encounters the burning bush, the image of the self, the voice of destiny calling him forward. In the same way, the empath steps into their wilderness, uncertain yet compelled by something larger than choice. Their exile is not accidental. It is a prelude to revelation. And yet exile is not without pain. Do not imagine the empath as joyfully walking away, unburdened and free. They carry with them grief, guilt, and longing. The human heart does not move as swiftly as the self. It takes time for the conscious ego to catch up with what the unconscious has already decreed. During this period, dreams often reveal them wandering alone, dragging heavy luggage, or crossing barren landscapes under a dim sky. These images are not signs of failure, but of transformation. The psyche is cleansing itself, stripping away the false identity once bound to old attachments. And it is here, in this solitude, that the archetype of shadow awakens with full force. For alone, the empath can no longer escape their own darkness. In relationships, they were consumed by the shadows of others, always caring, always absorbing, always deflecting. But now in isolation, they must confront the shadow within, the anger they suppressed, the desire they denied, the hunger they disowned. This confrontation is terrifying, for the empath has often built an identity on being the good one, the selfless giver. To suddenly see rage, selfishness, or despair lurking inside is to feel the mask crack and fall away. And yet without this shattering, there can be no individuation. The shadow must be faced and embraced. In their dreams, it may appear as a monster that pursues them, a dark figure demanding recognition. At first they run, but eventually they must turn. Look directly at it and listen. When they finally face the figure, they discover it is not only a terror, but a keeper of treasure, a key to their own rejected power. By integrating this shadow, they move toward wholeness. They cease to be defined only as empaths marked by wounds. They begin to emerge as human beings, complete, with boundaries, with strength, and with desire. The empath who returns from shadow work is not the same. They are less easily manipulated, less easily drained, less likely to be pulled into roles that no longer belong to them. They have discovered the fire that truly belongs to them, a flame that had been hidden under years of silence and sacrifice. Why then do they never return? Because once they have tasted this wholeness, once they have breathed in the air of freedom, they cannot step back into fragmentation. To return would be to betray their own growth, to amputate the very parts of themselves they have just reclaimed. Individuation always demands sacrifice, and the sacrifice here is the comfort of the old bond, the familiarity of what once was. The soul demands wholeness, and once wholeness has been glimpsed, it cannot be forgotten or denied. There is also the archetype of the wanderer. After exile and the painful confrontation with shadow, the empath often enters a period of wandering, not aimless, but deeply seeking. They may shift careers, relocate to unfamiliar landscapes, pursue spiritual practices long avoided, or finally give breath to creative work that was once suppressed. This wandering is not chaos, but the soul searching for its rightful vessel. It is the quest for the form in which their energy can flow without exploitation, without being siphoned away. The empath transforms less of a mirror for others, more of a flame for themselves. They remain sensitive, yes, still attuned to the subtleties of the world, but now their sensitivity serves creation rather than sacrifice. Their light is no longer for consumption. It becomes generative, alive, sovereign. To those who once knew them, this transformation can be bewildering, even painful. The person who once absorbed every wound now speaks of boundaries with unshakable clarity. The one who once endured silence now demands honesty, even if it disrupts comfort. The one who once stayed, no matter the cost, now leaves without looking back, leaving behind those who depended on their old role. To others, it may feel like betrayal, but it is not betrayal, it is rebirth. The empath has stepped into a new archetype, one that stands closer to the self. And here lies the most mystical truth. The empath's departure is not merely about personal healing, it is also about collective balance. We live in a culture that demands endless empathy, endless giving, endless sacrifice, and it glorifies those who comply without resistance. But this worship is false, for it feeds on exploitation and burnout. When the empath refuses, when they walk away, they embody a collective correction. They reveal through their very absence that empathy without boundaries collapses into self-destruction. Their vanishing becomes a protest from the unconscious against a culture that devours the sensitive and praises the sacrificial lamb. If you are the empath who has left, know this. Your departure is sacred. It is not abandonment, it is initiation. You have walked into exile so that you may find the self. You have faced the shadow so that you may become whole. You have wandered so that you may return, not to others, but to yourself. And if you never return to the old place, it is because the soul does not recycle old prisons. It seeks new horizons. And if you are the one left behind, know that this absence is also sacred. An emptiness that carries meaning, a silence that demands reflection. It forces you to confront your own hunger, your own shadow, your own dependence. It is a mirror of what you could not see before, an image that had been waiting in silence until the absence of the empath revealed it. Do not chase the empath into their exile, for they are not yours to hold, not a possession to be reclaimed. Instead, turn inward. Ask yourself with honesty, why was I so dependent on their endless giving? What part of me could not stand on its own 2 feet? What shadow have I denied within myself that quietly fed on their sensitivity? These questions may sting, But in answering them, you begin your own individuation, your own path of becoming. So you see, this mystery of departure and non-return is not merely about people and relationships. It is about the great dance of archetypes, the eternal rhythm of sacrifice and individuation, exile and transformation, shadow and self. The empath leaves because the soul commands it, and they never return because the soul does not go backwards, never retraces steps into what has already been transcended. They disappear without warning because the unconscious does not explain itself in neat, rational sentences. It simply acts with the clarity and force of natural law. And yet within this act lies meaning. For those who leave, it becomes the path to wholeness. For those who are left behind, it is the summons to confront themselves. And for the collective, it is a reminder that empathy must always be balanced with strength, that true love is impossible without boundaries. Giving must be paired with limits. Sacrifice cannot be endless. The empath who departs becomes a silent prophet of these truths. They vanish into the night, but their absence speaks louder than any presence could ever manage. There is a moment in every myth when the hero passes a threshold and cannot turn back, when the bridge behind them is burned by destiny. The empath's departure is such a threshold. Once they have crossed into exile, faced the shadow, and tasted the fire of their own wholeness, the old world dissolves behind them like a dream upon waking. This is not cruelty nor indifference, but the natural law of the psyche. The self does not allow regressions into prisons already abandoned. Individuation moves forward, always forward, like a river that refuses to flow uphill, no matter how much longing tries to push it back. And you may still wonder, why does the empath not at least return to explain, to offer words of closure? But closure is a concept of the rational ego, not of the unconscious. The unconscious speaks differently. It speaks through images, through silences, through ruptures that cannot be neatly contained in sentences. When an empath departs without warning, the silence is the message. The sudden absence is the dream come alive, the archetype stepping into flesh. The psychic image is made real. To demand explanations is to refuse the mystery. To sit within the silence is to hear what words could never say. This silence is both terrible and holy. It is terrible because it wounds, it unsettles, it strips away illusion, and it is holy because it awakens. It forces both the empath and the one left behind to encounter themselves without distraction, without escape. In the silence, you will find your own voice, or else you will drown in your own noise. The empath's absence is like the desert into which prophets are driven, vast, unyielding, a place where the old life is stripped away and something unimagined begins to stir. And what is the desert, if not both a trial and a womb? In that barren stillness, something new is born. Let us speak now of destiny. The empath who has left is not merely wandering without aim. Their departure is the opening of a new archetypal journey, one that the conscious ego rarely foresees. They may become healers who no longer bleed themselves dry, but who offer their medicine from a place of fullness. They may emerge as creators who channel their rare sensitivity into art that moves others, teachers who embody compassion without losing themselves to sacrifice. They may take the shape of the wise one, the figure who gives not out of compulsion or guilt, but out of abundance. Their empathy, once a wound endlessly exploited by others, transforms. It becomes a gift tempered by fire, like gold refined in the furnace. This transformation cannot be undone. Once they have seen the pattern of depletion, once they have recognized the unbearable cost of staying too long, they cannot unsee it. Their destiny calls them forward with an urgency that cannot be denied. If you have ever wondered why they never return, it is because they are already somewhere else. Not only somewhere else in geography or in outer relationships, but in soul. They have entered a new level of consciousness, one that makes the old bonds impossible to resume. To step back would mean to fracture themselves, to live in contradiction, to betray the wholeness they have fought so hard to claim. Individuation does not permit this. The self demands integrity above comfort. Thus, their non-return is not rejection, it is fidelity to the soul itself. Consider for a moment the archetype of death and rebirth. The empath's departure is a symbolic death. They die to the identity of the endless giver, the sacrificial lamb, the one who stayed until every ounce of life was drained. And in that death, they are reborn into wholeness. Just as in physical death one cannot return to the body once it has been shed, in psychic death one cannot return to the old life once it has been transcended. This is why reconciliation, if it comes at all, can only happen at a different level, never within the same form. The silence left behind by their departure is not simply absence, it is also an invitation for those abandoned, an invitation to face themselves, to stand without the crutch of another's endless empathy, to find balance from within rather than borrowing it from someone else. It is an initiation into self-sufficiency, into shadow work, into one's own wholeness. And for the empath, that silence becomes something else entirely. It is an invitation to listen inwardly, to finally hear the subtle music of the self that was long drowned out by the cries, demands, and chaos of others. Silence is not the end, it is the beginning of dialogue with the unconscious. Many resist this truth. They cling to the comforting fantasy that the empath will one day return, that the silence will break, that the old familiar pattern can somehow be restored. But this is nostalgia for a prison, a longing for chains that once felt like safety. To grow is to release, to accept the absence as a teacher, to allow the silence to shape you, to recognize that departure itself is transformation. The true reconciliation is not with the person who left, but with the part of yourself that depended on them, the part that must now learn to stand alone. The true closure is not in words spoken across a table, but in symbols revealed in the inner world. So I tell you, when the empath leaves without warning and never returns, it is not a personal failure, not an accident, not a cruel whim. It is the psyche fulfilling its own timeless law. It is the self demanding life over death, wholeness over fragmentation, and integrity over compromise. What may appear as abandonment on the surface is, in truth, the hidden language of transformation. It is the archetype moving as it has always moved, through exile, through shadow, through death, and into transformation. This has been the rhythm since the beginning of myth itself. If you are the one who has left, do not torment yourself with guilt or shame. You have obeyed a deeper command, one that speaks not in words, but in undeniable impulses of the soul. You have not abandoned. You have returned to yourself, to the center that had long been neglected. If you are the one left behind, do not be consumed by bitterness or despair. What you have been given is not merely loss, it is a mirror held up to your own depths. You have been thrust into a confrontation with your own shadow, forced to look at what had long been hidden. This is not punishment, but invitation. This is your chance to grow. And if you discover that you are both, if within you lives both the empath who departs and the one who feels abandoned, then know that this drama is not only external, but also profoundly internal. We all carry within us the part that gives until it is empty and the part that consumes without end. When these two forces finally confront one another in the inner world, then true wholeness begins to emerge. The empath within you must one day walk away from the parasite within you. Only then does the wholeness of the self rise from the ashes of this inner death. And this is why empaths leave without warning, because the self does not warn. It awakens sudden as dawn breaking after the longest night. This is why they never return, because the self does not regress. It does not undo its own growth. It transforms. The departure is not a rejection of life, but the silence of the unconscious made visible, the absence that teaches more than any presence could. In this silence, you will either fall into despair or you will discover the unfathomable depths of your own soul. The empath's vanishing is not the end. It is a passage, an initiation, a mystery that demands to be lived rather than explained. It is the psyche's way of declaring with finality, no more death by sacrifice, only life through wholeness. And if you dare to listen closely, you will hear, hidden in their silence, the voice of your own destiny calling.